Hey, Ethan, please start. Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome and thank you for joining. This is my talk. We stopped a logging plan in California, and you can too. And I'm Ethan Arutunian. Hold on. So I've divided my talk into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to give you a short background about myself. I'm going to talk about California logging in the past 30 years, the Cal Water watershed system, what I call checkerboard logging. I'm going to ask the question about sustainability, and we're going to look at sustainability methods such as equivalent clear-cut area and modeling biomass. And then I'll talk a short bit about the Gualala River and Middle South Fork Gualala. And in part two, I want to introduce some of the acronyms and actors involved in the timber harvest plan approval process, talk about the timber harvest plan document structure itself, your public comments, the official response to comments, how to file a California Environmental Quality Act lawsuit, how to use the California Environmental Quality Act, and some legal examples from our own lawsuit in the Bootleg timber harvest plan.
Ethan, could I stop just a minute and ask people to please put their questions in the chat, and Kristen will ask them later on, but just write them in the chat and she'll ferret them out. Okay, continue. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, so really quickly about me, I'm originally from Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. I moved to Washington to go to college at Whitman College, where I got bachelor's in physics, math, and computer science. Then I headed back to the Bay Area to start a career in tech. Then it was back to Washington for grad school in Seattle at University of Washington, where I raised a family, and then headed back, finally settled near Gualala. But basically, I've been going back and forth for 35 years, probably over 100 times, both flying and driving along the West Coast. And here's one of my favorite areas I like to pass through. It's the I-5 um, Mount Shasta corridor. Sorry, you can see Mount Shasta in the top of the image, and I-5 is the yellow line along the left side. This picture was taken by satellite in December of '89, so it's right around the time that I would have been going home for my first Christmas vacation from college. I'm going to show you a time lapse now of how this area has changed over 35 years. And I need to warn you that if you have never looked at time-lapsed satellite imagery of California before, it can be kind of disturbing. And you might ask, is this real? And I guarantee you it is. I'm going to start the time lapse. Oh, dang it, this thing keeps. All right. So the first 10 years, we don't really see much change, but then around 2000, we start to see pock marks showing up all over, basically little clear cuts. And this is where we end in 2020. So in '89, that area looked like this. In 2020, it looks like this. Well, what about Highway 101? I love taking that route too, along Redwoods National Park, which is outlined here in the middle of this image in green. Uh, you don't really see forest or timber harvest from the road. Let's see what that has changed or not over 35 years. Here, I'll start the time lapse. Again, the first 10 years, you don't see anything really, but then around 2000, sure enough, all these pock marks, both along the whole eastern side of the national park and the western side, until pretty much in 2020, most of those areas have been cut. So there it is in '89, and here's 2020. So what is going on? Introducing watershed planning areas. Okay, this system was created in '99 to basically standardize between all the different agencies that needed to talk about watersheds. And they divided California into just over 7,000 mini watersheds, where each one is between 3,000 and 10,000 acres. And the system is called today Cal Water version 221. I call it checkerboard logging. Here's another area. This is the Tuolumne River area near Bear Valley, where I learned how to ski as a kid. And this is showing timber harvest plans outlined in red in the last 30 years. The forest practice rules say an agency only needs to consider the small watershed planning area, that's one of those areas outlined in blue, when analyzing environmental impacts of a timber harvest plan. And it doesn't need to consider any effects downstream. And they only need to consider impacts in the past 10 years. So if we just look at timber harvest plans that have been proposed during the past 10 years, you can see tons of areas that are still haven't recovered, that are over 10 years or harvested over 10 years ago. All these dry clear cuts that are not outlined. So the question that I had to ask myself when I started looking at this was, is this sustainable? Well, sustainable means able to be maintained at a certain rate or level. And Webster says of, relating to, or being a method of harvesting or using a resource so that the resource is not depleted or permanently damaged. Well, how do we measure sustainability? In the timber industry in California, we don't. Okay, there's a reluctance to quantify or put any thresholds on what sustainability might look like with numbers. They'll tell you that all the watersheds are different, and there's this sort of everything looks good to me mentality. But there are ways to measure sustainability, and one of them is called equivalent clear-cut area. And this method you'll find pretty common in the industry. Equivalent clear-cut area is simply the number of clear-cut acres divided by the total acres in the watershed. So for example, if you were going to cut 100 clear-cut acres in a watershed area that was 10,000 acres, that would be an ECA of 1%. And if it was a 200-acre clear cut, the ECA would be 2%. There are different types of timber harvests. There's one called a selection, where we only cut, say, half the trees. And for that, we use a 50% multiplier. Well, equivalent clear-cut area has a lot of problems. For one thing, there are no established limits or thresholds on how much is too much. It doesn't really consider any of the existing conditions in that forest, and it ignores cumulative effects from past harvests. It also includes anything that's an open space or an urban area, like a big airport. It all counted as timberland, and it ignores any wildfire damage that may have previously occurred. If we go back to this area under Shasta that I showed earlier along I-5, taking a look at one of these watershed planning areas, the Middle Soda Creek. Outlined in red and listed on the right are the timber harvest plans from the past 25 years. When I plot those every year with the acres of the timber harvest plan in red, and then orange is the accumulation of all the timber harvest plans over time, you can see that in the past 25 years, this watershed has pretty much been entirely harvested. But when you look at equivalent clear-cut area, kind of tells a different story. Prior to 10 years ago, there was one big cut in 2002, and the ECA was at 2%. And in the past 10 years, there have been a lot of cuts, but the ECA is only 1.2%, which the industry would say this was probably pretty much just fine. Well, there's other ways to measure sustainability, and there's one way called watershed modeling. And I've built a biomass model, which is a computer program that simulates tree growth and harvesting over time. It starts with an initial estimate of the number and the ages of the trees that are already in the watershed, and then it uses a published scientific formula for the tree growth rates, applying each timber harvest plan every year. When we use the biomass model in the Middle Soda Creek watershed, we see the real story. The blue line indicates what the watershed would look like if it was untouched over the last 25 years. And the orange is the actual reality with timber harvests taking place. You can see in 2002 a big drop, and then basically the biomass model flatlines until about 10 years ago when it kind of takes a nosedive. Moving closer to where I have settled, the Gualala River watershed. This river consists of 29 of those mini watershed planning areas, which is relatively small for a river watershed by Californian standards. And inside of the Gualala River basin, there are currently 15 active timber harvest plans. Now, inside of one of those watershed planning areas, the Middle South Fork Gualala, there have been something like 8 plans in the last 10 years. This watershed area is 7,900 acres, of which 20% of it is actually just open space, and 30% has been harvested in the last 10 years. But again, when we apply the ECA model that the industry likes to use, we see kind of a similar story. Prior to 10 years ago, this watershed was hardly harvested at all. Then there was a change of ownership, and in the past 10 years, you can see a lot of timber harvesting taking place, but also some off years, so that the total, or that the average ECA is actually 0.9 or under 1%, which again, the industry would say is just fine. But when you look at biomass model, you see the real story. The watershed is doing great up until 2012, when the timber harvesting really kicks in, and basically it flatlines and it's headed downhill by 2020. And that's when the Bootleg timber harvest plan was proposed. And spoiler alert, we fought the plan and we won. And Bootleg didn't happen. And this is what the biomass model looks like more or less today for that watershed. So it's taking an uphill turn. Now I'm going to talk about how to take on a timber harvest plan. First, some acronyms that you need to know. The California Environmental Quality Act, we pronounce that CEQA. The Forest Practice Act is the FPA. The Forest Practice Rules are the FPRs. The Timber Harvest Plan is a THP, and an Environmental Impact Report is an EIR. Some of the actors involved are the Registered Professional Forester, which is always known as the RPF, the Licensed Timber Operator. This is the person or company that actually harvests the trees. That's the LTO. The landowner. Then you have the lead agency in charge of reviewing the plan. That's California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, who we all know as CALFIRE. And the other agencies involved in reviewing a timber harvest plan: California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Regional Water Quality Control Board, California Geological Survey, and there's an archaeologist that's usually provided by CALFIRE. Well, first, it's important if you're going to get involved to understand the structure of a timber harvest plan document. And CALFIRE has a website called CalTrees. You can just Google that, where they allow the public to monitor and download timber harvest plans. The timber harvest plan is a document that outlines every detail of the logging operation, and it can be several hundred pages long. It serves as the functional equivalent to an environmental impact report. It's submitted by a registered professional forester who is licensed by the state, and it has a defined structure, which is 6 sections. Every document that goes along with the timber harvest plan is scanned and uploaded into the CalTrees website separately. So that can make navigating a timber harvest plan pretty cumbersome. It's also important to understand the approval process, because remember, the timber harvest plan is always approved. It's like getting a building permit. If you want to build a house, you're going to get some plans, you're going to submit them to the city or the county, and they're going to work with you until they're satisfied, and then they'll approve your plan, give you a permit. A timber harvest plan works the same way. You submit the plan, or the forester does, to CALFIRE, and they'll work with the forester until it meets their standards, and then the plan gets approved. So the steps in the process are basically the forester submits the original plan, and then there's the first review. That's when all the agencies have a chance to take a look at it. They'll provide some initial comments and send it back for updates. The forester will make the changes and send it back in. And then CALFIRE will schedule what's called the pre-harvest inspection. This is when all the different agencies involved have a chance to actually go on site and look at the location. Oftentimes, several of the agencies won't show up, but some of them will, and they'll provide more comments to the forester, who will then modify their timber harvest plan and resubmit it. At that point, CALFIRE schedules what's called the second review, or the final review. This is basically when CALFIRE meets with the forester and asks them to make any final changes to the plan. It's usually typographical corrections or minor details. After that, and those corrections are made and resubmitted, then CALFIRE will approve the plan. But before they do, there's a public comment period of 10 more days where the public is allowed to submit any final concerns they have before approval, and then approval happens. It's also important to understand the public's role, which is basically to provide comments. And comments can be submitted anytime during this entire process. But as I just mentioned, the deadline is 10 days after that second review. Now, the only way to keep track of that is to watch on this CalTrees website. When you write a comment, you must cite significant environmental concerns. It's not enough to just say that you like trees and it makes you sad that they're going to cut the trees, because that's not a significant environmental concern. Significant concern is something like traffic and noise, or sedimentation and erosion in the river, or an increase in wildfire risk. Maybe you're concerned about protected species, or the sustainability or cumulative effects in the watershed, or the viewshed. That's the area that you can see. And there can be legal concerns. Public comments can slow down the process, but don't get your hopes up, because they're only responded to. They're not acted upon. And THPs, like I said, they're always approved. Now, if you do write a public comment with an environmental concern, significant concern, you'll get back an official response. And it'll say something like this: CALFIRE has considered all pertinent evidence and has determined that no significant adverse cumulative impacts are likely to result from implementing this THP. This determination is based on the framework provided by the FPA, the California Code of Regulations, and additional mitigation measures specific to this THP. Or if you're lucky like me, you might get one in all caps. All concerns raised were reviewed and addressed, along with the framework provided by the Forest Practice Act and rules of the Board of Forestry, and the addition of the mitigation measures specific to this THP. The department has determined that there will be no significant impacts resulting from implementing this THP. So this is where I like to pause here in this presentation and just put on our thinking caps for a minute. And I want to introduce something that I think is important if you're reading a timber harvest plan, and that's called critical thinking. This is disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, persistent to truth, and informed by evidence. Critical thinking is credited to Socrates, who realized the unreliability of authority and of authority figures to possess knowledge and consequent insight. Basically, you can't rely on authority to necessarily possess a lot of knowledge, and that for an individual man or woman to lead a good life that is worth living, that person must ask critical questions and possess an interrogative soul, which seeks evidence and then closely examines the available facts, and then follows the implications of the statement under analysis, thereby tracing the implications of thought and action. This is actually really important because it plays into the law. As soon as you start reading a timber harvest plan, or if you do, you're probably going to start with section 1, which is the first section. It's the shortest. And you're going to realize every section has flaws. When you get to the end of section 1, you come to item 13, the statement of environmental impact. And here are 2 check boxes. It says, after considering the rules of the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection and the mitigation measures incorporated in THP, I, the registered professional forester, have determined that the timber operations will have a significant impact or will not have a significant impact. You will always see will not have a significant impact checked here. In fact, the whole purpose of a timber harvest plan is to provide a document that doesn't have a significant impact. So this box is almost redundant. You're never going to see somebody check the box that says that they are going to have an impact, and that might be shocking. And then just beyond that is the statement from the professional forester that says that this timber harvest plan, as prepared by the rules, will not have a significant impact. Implementation of the measures, along with responsible logging practices, will eliminate any significant adverse effects. Well, the only way to challenge CALFIRE's approval is in court. And it's not that hard to do. You need to form a group of concerned citizens. So you only need really 3 or more. Then you need to submit your public comments, which are your significant environmental concerns, from the group, and find a CEQA attorney to represent you, strategize for funding, and then your attorney will file a CEQA lawsuit, hopefully as soon as possible, including a preliminary injunction and a temporary restraining order, which need declarations from experts that harm will occur. And hopefully that can all happen quickly before any logging takes place. A lawsuit must be filed within 30 days from the date of the approval of the timber harvest plan. That's your window. After that, live with that. Well, what are you going to do? So you're going to use the California Environmental Quality Act. Timber harvest plans have to meet the standards of CEQA. And this came from our ruling in the Bootleg hearing. The judge said, at the hearing, CALFIRE and RPF contended that the analysis is sufficient because it complies with the FPA and the FPR. They argue that the THP shows that there will be no significant impacts or otherwise include adequate analysis. And the THP states that it complies with the FPR requirements. They specifically raised this argument with respect to the THP's discussion of environmental impacts, cumulative impacts, and alternatives. However, they ignore the fact that a THP must also meet the standards of CEQA. Okay, so that's part 1. He also said, under CEQA, there must be substantial evidence and sufficient analysis to provide the analytic route which the agency applied in reaching its conclusion, the route from the evidence to the conclusion. CALFIRE and RPF therefore may not explain away a document's lack of information or analysis by claiming that it is sufficient for complying with the FPR and the FPA. If that were possible, then the clear mandate that such documents must comply with CEQA would be meaningless. Accordingly, a THP such as this must also satisfy of substantial CEQA requires. And I'm just going to pause and say that every THP is flawed in these ways, and they all are required to satisfy CEQA and provide the level of substantial evidence and analysis which CEQA requires. So THPs are supposed to function as the equivalent of environmental impact reports. And again, there's a legal precedent for this. To be legally adequate under CEQA, the analysis in an environmental impact report must facilitate informed decision-making and informed public participation, with the word informed being critical here. An adequate discussion of environmental impacts also must include a disclosure of the analytic route, again, that the agency traveled from evidence to action. I want to give you some examples of arguments that we made in our case And these could also be used in your own public comments or in your own battles. So regarding sedimentation and biological resources, said the THP fails to provide sufficient information and analysis to enable meaningful public review of the impacts of the proposed timber harvesting on sedimentation and biological resources, which renders it legally inadequate. We said the THP does not disclose the analytic route traveled from evidence to action. Rather, it simply states that with mitigation, such impacts will be of a less than significant magnitude, and it's not possible to gain a meaningful understanding of the project's erosion, sedimentation, and effects on endangered salmonids and amphibians armed only with the THP's vague promises. Again, basically, it's not possible for the public to understand how these things aren't going to happen just based on these vague statements that are made in the THP. That's kind of summarizing it. And the court agreed. They said it's also on its face a generic form document, partly a checklist with no details on the efficacy of the measures whatsoever or what in fact they will actually achieve. It's not even apparent whether the description of the measures set forth are specific to this project or merely just a generic list of measures that CALFIRE requires. Nothing here that the court sees provides the required analysis. And that something merely appears to be the case is not evidence that it actually is the case. There is no explanation of what appears means or the methodology or criteria used or anything else clear and concrete. In short, this is not substantial evidence and it is not meaningful analysis of anything. There is no evidence that the risk of increased sediment actually is relatively low. Moreover, there is no explanation of what is meant by stating that the risk of increased sediment is relatively low. This does not state what it is relative to or how or why. This demonstrates that there will be no significant impacts. Other sections are no different. So we totally won on that argument. Here's an example for cultural and archaeological impacts. This is a really interesting section in the THP. It's an entire section. Remember, there's only 6. It's section 6. The cultural and archaeological impact section is left completely blank to the public because all cultural and archaeological impacts are considered confidential. But in fact, the only thing that's really confidential are the locations and a few other details. So what we argued was the public was prohibited with no statutory basis from obtaining specific information about the archaeological and cultural surveys and their results, making a meaningful understanding of the project's impacts all the more impossible to obtain. And the court agreed. They said, excluding from the public record information regarding cultural resources which was not shielded from public disclosure clearly made informed self-government impossible in this regard and defeated the policies of CEQA. Absent authority which actually justifies the failure to make this information public, this constitutes a failure to proceed in the manner required by law and violates CEQA. So we went on that point. For cumulative impacts, we said the THP's analysis of cumulative impacts violates CEQA and the FPA for the same reason that the analysis of individual environmental impacts violates it. It contains no meaningful information at all. Instead, the THP contains only a series of circular statements that the project will not cause any significant cumulative impact solely because it supposedly will not cause any significant individual impacts. The argument in the THP and the CALFIRE will give you is that, yeah, that THP didn't cause any impacts, so that means there are no cumulative impacts. And the court loved this one. They said, this section of the THP addresses this issue in an exceedingly unclear manner, evidently concluding without substantial evidence or analysis that the project will not cause significant impacts merely because it complies with the FPA and FPR, and then reasoning, to the extent the reasoning is even evident, that because the project or other projects will not cause any significant impacts, there cannot be any cumulative significant impacts. This discussion misses the point entirely. As explained above, the analysis must consider whether the impacts of this and other activities, even if individually less than significant, will be cumulatively significant. So we won on that point as well. And there's one more I want to share. This is the alternatives analysis. And here's the argument is that the THP fails to analyze a reasonable range of alternatives. Although the THP purports to consider 6 alternatives, which is required, it rejects all but one of these as infeasible. 5 of the 6 were dismissed based on a failure to meet the project objectives, but it's contrary to CEQA to limit the range of alternatives by utilizing unduly narrow project objectives. For this reason, the THP's decision to dismiss every alternative except itself cannot be sustained. And once again, judge agreed, said, the analysis is devoid of details or clear information and explanation sufficient to allow informed decision-making. The entire section devoted to alternatives analysis amounts to just under 4 pages. This is in a 370-page document. As noted, the THP essentially dismisses all alternatives out of hand without more than about 1/3 of a page of analysis for one of the alternatives, while the others are even more terse, all limited to a single short paragraph and one with as little as 3 sentences. The discussion of all is conclusory and generalized. So the judge didn't accept their alternative analysis either. We ended up winning on all 5 of those arguments. And in the end, I think they had an opportunity to correct all 5 of those things in 60 days, but there was no way to do that because a lot of that just cannot be corrected. So here are some of the key takeaways that I want to share. California's watersheds, as you saw, are rapidly disappearing. This is not rocket science or fancy math. All THPs are flawed. The bootleg THP is not unique. The bootleg THP is the exact same document as 5 other THPs that were approved by CALFIRE. All 5 of those are all the same document. They all violate CEQA in the same way. And I believe, honestly, that most THPs do this. And CALFIRE's approval process violates it. Like I said, we won on 5 completely different arguments. I want to definitely make a shout out to our supporters and our donors. And I want to say that anyone can do this. CALFIRE is not going to change. This case isn't going to change how they do things, but everyone who can should try to do this. Thank you. Now you got to unmute.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really great, Ethan. At this point, Kristen's going to ask some of the questions that you put in chat. If you didn't put your question in chat already, why, please do add it. And as soon as we get the recording from Zoom, we'll be sending this out and posting it on our website, which will probably be a day or 2. So, Kristen.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for putting your questions in the chat, and feel free to keep adding questions. So let's see. Our first question was near the beginning of the talk, and the question for you, Ethan, is please comment on the difference between logging controls on private land versus national forest.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert, but everything that I just told you is about logging on private lands, which is a lot of the lands, because I know Sierra Pacific, has most of the Sierra, and all that pockmarked logging that you saw in the original time lapse, that's all private land logging. And I can't really comment on the different styles or rules or laws.
Karen, did you want to comment at all on that question?
Yeah, I could. Thank you. So 60% of the land is owned by the federal government, and the other 40% about is owned by either individual owners or by the state. So 40% of it is managed by CALFIRE, and the rest of it is managed by the U.S. Forest Service or it's a national park.
And did you want to comment on the different rules, any differences that you know of that you think are material to share with this group?
So everything that Ethan went over has to do with timber harvest plans, which is the planning document used with CALFIRE. And the Forest Service has their own plans that they put out, and then people can comment on. And they're probably pretty different plans, different agencies. I think probably a lot of the things Ethan said are true for both, that they just kind of rubber stamp them. So,
Thanks, Karen.
okay.
Good question.
So, and it might be an interesting thing for us to explore in future as well. So secondly, how much of what you were showing is second growth, third growth, et cetera? And I'm assuming that's related to some of the maps you showed.
Yeah, most of what I showed, well, I guess it's hard to say because I'm guessing that the whole the Siskiyous area under Shasta is sort of second. The Gualala is second, third with some first old growth. So the Bootleg plan did have some old growth in it as well. It's a mix of old growth and second growth. So yeah, 1, 2, and 3 in the redwood land, and I'd say up by Shasta, it's probably more like second or third.
Oh, by the way, there was a question at the bottom asking if we could close the share screen so we can focus on the viewers. And everybody can also hit the view and say side by side gallery or great. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Ethan.
No problem.
So I'm skipping back to previous questions. Okay, so Ethan, can you provide a template for making a graph like yours showing cumulative logging acreage over time?
Yeah, I mean, really, you just need the data. And so my system only really works on my computer right now because there's so much data. There are and all the data is public data that's provided by CALFIRE, but my system imports all that into a big giant database. And so, one goal is to get that out into the public and that everybody could use that if that was put out into the cloud. But you need all the data in order to generate the graph. So that's the challenge.
So if someone wanted to do it themselves, do you have any tips?
Contact me and I'll hook you up with we'll figure out how to make the application work. Because it really does it sucks in every single timber harvest plan that has ever been that CALFIRE provides publicly, which is 35 years of timber harvest plans. And then it does all kinds of stuff with that. And then hooks that into the Google Earth maps and everything that you saw.
Can we provide your email address for people to contact you, Ethan?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. That's great. So there's a little bit of dialogue in the chat about Bootleg 2. And one of the writers said Bootleg 2 was resubmitted and is actively being logged, and it is bigger than the original Bootleg plan. What do you think of this? Or what do you make of this? And there was other chat about this, but can you comment on Bootleg 2?
Yeah, sure. So Bootleg 2 came along right after Bootleg, and we had already filed our lawsuit on Bootleg. And it was exactly, like I said, the same wordage and everything. We filed all of our public comments against it, and it was approved. And we actually filed a lawsuit, but we got our lawsuit in at the 30-day mark. And this time the foresters were ready and they had basically logged over 75% of that watershed already. And so when we went for we got the temporary restraining order, but it was kind of too late. And when we went for the preliminary injunction, it kind of became a moot point because most of the trees had already been cut at that point, and the argument was over, should they be allowed to, pull them out, or when, so we pulled the plug, and we gave up. So yeah, that one, they got it. But the takeaway is it was literally exactly the same plan. So if we had followed through all of these same arguments, every single one of them would have applied to that plan too.
That's so unfortunate.
Yeah.
So I think this may have been, I'm moving to the next question. This may have been answered already, but can you provide a reference to obtain more detail about the biomass model?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'd say contact me. I'm trying to kind of write up more details. I have a different kind of paper about that with more specifics about the different formula that go into it. But again, that all lives on that same sort of software application because it imports all that same timber harvest data when it does those models.
Okay, that's really generous. So again, just to clarify, was Bootleg 2 a completely different plan adjacent to the original Bootleg plan, or was it partly overlapping?
No, that's right. It was like a subsequent plan just next to the other one. Oh, they mentioned it was larger. It was slightly larger. Another 20 or 30 or 50 acres. I can't remember.
Okay. So going back to the positive ruling you achieved, how can this ruling be used to set precedents for how THPs insufficiently assess impacts?
Well, as far as I understand it, and I think my attorney could chime in more here if he wants to, but when you win in a superior county court like this, you don't set any legal precedent. So all of those quotes from our arguments and from the judge that I provided, and there's a lot more, the court's ruling is long and it's worth a read. These are just little clips. What was I saying? All of that is available. What was it? What was your question? Sorry.
So the question was about whether people could use this as a precedent.
Oh, right. So because we went in Superior Court, we don't actually set legal precedent, meaning that your attorney can't like cite our case in your case, but you could still use all of this in your public comments. If we were to win in an appeals court, and this was none of those arguments were appealed, by the way, which is pretty rare because usually CALFIRE would want to fight. But they didn't want to appeal that because if we had won those in an appeals court, which I think was a pretty high chance, then it would have set a legal precedent. And that is a higher bar. So that's the next step, really.
I see.
Dan, if you want to say more, I don't know how you raised your hand, but I think
Karen, can you unmute? Is it? I'm looking for him. What's? Yeah,
Ethan
good.
pretty much covered it. You could definitely use it in your public comments and say that the THP you're concerned about has all these same flaws and like it doesn't tell you in a meaningful way what the impacts are and this kind of thing. But like Ethan said, your attorney wouldn't be able to use it in a lawsuit.
So it could be used more as a model, but not as a legal precedence, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, CALFIRE should, if you use it in a comment, they theoretically should respond to why it's different. But like I said, you're not going to be able to use it in court.
I see. So some people were asking about the posting of the slides. So we do post the recordings on our website, which I posted in the chat. After this is over, we'll post the recording. And then we do typically send a link to the recording to everyone who signed up for this session, whether they were able to attend or not. And then, Ethan, is this the type of thing where your slides could also be posted, or would that be too complex since they have so many builds and videos and so on?
Oh, right. Yeah, I might just pull out like the beginning.
Okay,
Mhm.
that'd be great. So we'll also post our slides at the links that
You
will
and
be
them.
publicly available. And all of our previous forest protection forums are available on our website today. So the next question was from someone who said, we could not find a CEQA attorney to take our case, even though it was equally slam dunk. Do you have any suggestions?
That's a hard one. 'Cause I can't really put Dan on the spot, but they're very limited, few and far between. This is something we really need to work on in this state. Don't have a lot of CEQA attorneys.
I see. Next question. So there's a question that says, how can you address the legislature about this? And Frank, did you mean how can we as the community address the legislature, or did you mean how can Ethan address the legislature? I'm assuming it's how can we as a community address the legislature about this?
I think that we have to do this a few more times to get the point across to CALFIRE. But I mean, we certainly, people on this call attend the Board of Forestry meetings, and I think try to bring up some of these ideas, but it's no easy task. That's why I think that if we did this a few times, they would not want to keep going through it over and over, and they might be willing to make some changes to their rules.
Karen, can you please unmute Frank Torriello just so he can further give context to his question?
I just wanted to say you're right that it is about, as a community, how we can address the legislator to look into this. That I've seen that too. How the THPs are really like just a checklist, and some of the RPFs really put in some strange answers. There was one that all of the biomass would be resequestered in 10 years or something, which is an impossibility. So, that I think that's the difficult thing with CALFIRE is, and someone asked that question too, whether each individual THP has to be challenged, which is the case right now. And it would be much better to have a legislative fix to CALFIRE's practices.
Thank you, Frank. Ethan, any more comments on that question now that you heard the context from Frank?
No, yeah, thanks, Frank. It's nice to hear from you.
So the next question is, if this won't change anything, what did the lawsuit win exactly?
Well, exactly, it stopped the bootleg timber harvest plan, which was set aside and withdrawn. It also, I believe, changed landowners' mentality, and we may have set a different course for the watershed for the future. So I think we accomplished a lot. And all of those arguments, like I said, can be used again successfully, and that's sort of the point of this presentation.
Next question is, who were the lawyers and the law firm you had?
Yeah, you met him. That's Dan Garrett Steinman. Garrett Steinman Law Offices. He's in San Francisco.
And did you finance the lawsuit with small donations, large donations, or a combination of both?
It was a combination of both. And one thing we were able to do was we got support from a nonprofit that's Forest Unlimited, and they will help support different projects that they think are important. So people can donate to Forest Unlimited and specify which project they want their donation to go to. And so that was a way for people to donate, make it easier. But we had, yeah, a lot of smaller ones and a big donation from Friends of the Gualala River.
And how did you do the outreach to get donations and to get support?
Well, honestly, it was mostly friends and family of people in the group itself, and then the Friends of Gualala River. We didn't do any social media or anything like that.
And are you able to share what was the tab for legal fees, or is that something private?
Well, in our case, Dan took the case on a contingency. So it was pretty expensive, inexpensive for our group. But I think normally you would expect a 40 to 50 to plus $1,000 expense.
Thank you. And Jack, I'm going to get through the questions in the chat and then we'll go to you. Great. So another question would be, I think was already answered, which is what can a CEQA attorney cost and what might total fees look like? I think you were saying 40 to 50,000, Ethan, is that what you're
and up,
suggesting?
yeah.
And up. Okay, and where do many other people, if you know, get funding for this type of thing?
I don't really know. I know it just depends on your ability, your outreach. You know, I know people who've had a really hard time funding it. We didn't have such a hard time. We were tapped into a really generous community. So I think it just depends, but it's definitely something you want to strategize around. And hopefully if you have a convincing case that your attorney is convinced he can win on, then they'll take it on a contingency as well. It doesn't always work that way.
And what year was this lawsuit?
Well, we started in 2020, May of 2020.
And when did it end?
It was just finalized in August.
And is the appeal window long gone?
Well, that's a complicated story. So there's one other argument that we're still appealing on, and that's going to take another year or two, but the THP's already been set aside and withdrawn.
And also, are you available for consultation or expert input to groups that are also fighting specific THPs?
I mean, I'm not an expert by any means, but I certainly make all this data that I can provide available, and I'm happy to provide all the knowledge and information that I have to any groups.
Thank you. And everybody, we will send Ethan's email address out when we send the follow-up email. So thank you, Ethan, for making yourself available. Next question. So we talked about who was the attorney. Did you have additional legal advisors or other kinds of advice that helped advise you on bringing this to court? And does Sierra Club supply this service? And maybe if that's a second part of the question that Karen could answer if Ethan doesn't have that.
I did get some support. I mentioned Forest Unlimited earlier. Rick Coates is the executive director of Forest Unlimited, and he provides a workshop, which is actually a PDF that kind of walks through a lot of the steps that I outlined on what steps you would want to take if you were going to move forward, and talks about all the public comments and whatnot. It's a very useful workshop. So definitely started there. And then just mentioning the Sierra Club, Rick did present to the Sierra Club group once, so that was provided, but I don't think they do provide anything specially.
The Sierra Club has lawyers, but they use them for their own campaigns. They're not kind of available to, you know, they're not available to the public or even to Sierra Club members. It has to be kind of associated with the campaign. There's a legal aspect to it, so.
Thank you, Karen. That's helpful. So there are some questions about other states. Is the Forest Unlimited advice only applicable for California? And if so, is there other avenues you would suggest going for people in other states for getting advice and help for timber harvest on private land?
Yeah, I think it's really different. And unfortunately, all I know is what I described here, which is really California private timber harvesting. We tried at Friends of Gualala River to do a federal lawsuit on the Endangered Species Act, and that was a failure. So it's hard to say. I couldn't, but maybe somebody here would know more.
Does anyone else have that answer, Karen?
I think it's all different agencies, a different process, and I don't have the details to provide you, but it's not what he went through. What he went through is specific to CALFIRE in California.
Okay. By the way, there's a lot of questions coming in rapidly. We've reached the 5 o'clock point. What I would propose based on talking with Ethan is that we will continue to go forward with these questions for the next 15 minutes. Does that work for you, Ethan?
Sure.
And anyone who needs to leave at this time, feel free to leave because it is the 5 o'clock hour. And we're very thankful to everyone who has come, and we will go ahead and take some of the remaining questions as we're able to. So one person had asked, what are some of the experiences that allowed you to be able to create your resource planning tools or credentials or background you had that allowed you to create resource planning tools?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I am a professional software engineer with a lot of background in GIS and databases. And so this for me was kind of like another one of these big data mapping projects that I've done in the past, ingesting huge amounts of data, applying different analyses to it, and then the geographical mapping piece. But I really, the biomass model is something that I built to try to understand if we really were performing sustainable, what I would think of as sustainable logging, or if something else was going on. Because like I showed with those ECA numbers, when you talk to people in the industry, everything's fine. And I just couldn't put together how everything was fine with what I was seeing on the road and from the air. And so I came up with maybe I could model it. And that's when it all kind of clarified for me. Oh, okay. I see what's going on when you look at it this way.
And
But
it sounds like it,
yeah,
go ahead. It
I
sounds
don't
like
have-
it's something you created more for your own knowledge. It's not like something you're selling or something. It's something you
Right.
created for yourself.
Yeah. I don't have a degree in forestry. It was exactly that. And it's not, we didn't use it in the legal arguments. The legal arguments are the ones that I showed you about how the timber harvest plans have to follow CEQA and they don't. but it's a very convincing way and a real way to use math and published science. These formulas are not very fancy, like the growth rate of a tree. It's pretty, I mean, it's specific to the types of trees, but otherwise it's pretty simple formula. It really illuminates what's going on.
Thank you. So are we correct in understanding that the LTOs log Bootleg in 30 days? Is that a correct understanding, or was it something else?
They cut 75% of the trees inside of those first 30 days.
Jesus.
That's what they said.
I see. And then I'm not sure if I understand this question, but somebody said, were you able to use Google Earth overhead maps 35 years ago? I don't think so, but in other words, were some of those overhead maps gathered by some other means long before Google Earth?
All that satellite imagery has been either purchased or collected by Google. It's either public, NASA satellite data or whatever. They use they use airplanes more these days, but I think in the 80s, those images were probably satellite imagery. And Google's put that all together. And actually, they have a website which is called Google Time-Lapse. If you just type that in, you'll get there. It's a Google Earth engine. And you can zoom all over the planet and you can watch these time lapses just like what I showed you. And you can zoom in anywhere in California that there used to be forests. You're going to see the same patchwork clear cutting that I showed you in Shasta and on the coast, especially if you look anywhere along the Sierras. But it's also, you can watch glaciers melt. You can watch anything from Google Time-Lapse.
So another person,
but I found these results on search.
I'm sorry, my Google Hub is speaking because we keep mentioning the name, so I'll stop mentioning the name. So is it true that a THP's impacts in one planning watershed are not added to another THP's in an adjacent planning watershed? One of our participants asked.
That's right. Yeah, they only have to consider that one planning watershed. That's kind of the point of the planning watershed, is it makes it easier for them to sort of think about what the impacts could be. They don't have to consider all these larger areas, and they establish the system so that now all the agencies would talk about the same area. Prior to 99, I think it was a little bit more of a mess. And again, only the last 10 years in that area.
And so another person is asking to clarify. So the thing that was won in this lawsuit was stopping one single THP, right? And does that mean each THP would need to be sued separately?
Yeah. There have been attempts to file other kinds of lawsuits, like a pattern and practice lawsuit, where you might say, CALFIRE has established a pattern and practice of doing the same thing over and over on all these different timber harvest plans, and, try to attack it from that angle. But this was just one timber harvest plan.
I see. So Karen, can you unmute Jack? Because I think he opened his hand around that time in the question series.
Okay.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so first, thank you so much, Kristen and Karen, for hosting these. And thank you, Ethan, for, I'm surprised to say, an uplifting presentation, as opposed to the usual, all is lost, they're going to kill everything. Dan, I want to contact you, young feller. This is California CalParks working with their buddies CALFIRE, Tomales Bay State Park, what I call the deforestation plan, they call the Forest Health Initiative, to make Bishop Fines healthy with, the ancient cultural practices of chainsaws, chippers, masticators, and herbicides. There's a few other people on this call that are part of this ad hoc group in the Bay Area, and I'd very much like to talk to you about it. Yeah, I could go on, but anyway, thank you for that. And I do want to reach out, and you give me a little bit of hope, as opposed to, all is lost.
Thank you, Jack. And did you have a specific question also?
I guess not. I just wanted to make, in the old fashioned days, people used to get together. It's before, you guys aren't old enough to remember, people talk to each other in groups of people with rooms, you know, in the same room. And I just wanted people to hear my voice and feel my passion for the forests that are being destroyed. And I'm reading the comments, so, you know, I'm not alone in this group, thank God. And I, again, wanted you to feel the thank you, that it's sincere. And Dan, I'm coming for you.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you. So the next question is, what HUC does the mini watershed correspond to? Meaning hydrologic unit code. I probably massacred that, but anyway, Ethan.
I guess, are they talking about the Gualala Basin? I'd have to look it up, but it was on one of those slides.
Okay. So someone asked, Ethan, you suggested that it is common for THPs to be written narrowly and lacking in details like this. Do you have any sense why more legal actions haven't had more success historically?
Yeah, I've heard that actually there is a lot of success in this regard. It's just, honestly, it's exhausting and draining, and nobody wants to do it. And when you do lose, it hurts, and it's hard to go back and do it again. But you know, like Rick Coates in his workshop, he does indicate that oftentimes you can win like this. Doesn't necessarily stop anything. I mean, they can resubmit another plan in the same area and we can go through this all again. But in this case, there's a real chance that we have changed sort of the mentality. We may have exhausted a bit of what they want to do. And so it may actually have made a big difference.
Right, because the person also said it feels like the success of the case opens more opportunities for new cases. Is that something you think is true?
I certainly think that these arguments are viable for most THPs that I've read. So I'd love for other people to try it again, and I hope that I can do it again as well.
And the next one is more of a hypothetical question or a philosophical question, which is, THPs can be won by lawsuits, but do we have time considering the extensive impacts cumulatively that we face?
Well, that's why we would need to act now and get those temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions filed, because they halt any logging as soon as that happens. And that's not that hard to do. If you file the lawsuit, all you need to do to get those is to just show that there's a decent chance that there'll be some significant environmental harm. And it's not that hard to find experts in the field who are willing to say that, because they know it's true and you can find them to write it down. And that's all you need, but that will stop it. But you know, the only plans that we could stop right now are the ones that have been approved in the last 30 days. And then anything coming up, you'd be ready. You have to be ready for it.
I see. So I think you may have answered this, but was the biomass model considered in the Bootleg case?
Yeah, no, we didn't use any of that for our legal arguments.
So I'm going to take one more question, and I want to also refer everybody to the chat because there's also a lot of information in the chat in addition to questions. So was this an SPI project, another timber company, or a private owner, and would that make a difference?
I don't think it makes a difference, but people who have taken on SPI might say differently because I haven't taken them on. This wasn't SPI. It was another company who's also a private landowner. In fact, in this case, the landowner, the registered professional forester, and the licensed timber operator were all the same person. So there was some conflict of interest there. but that's their business. They're a professional forester.
By the way, does the lawsuit protect this land in perpetuity, or is there a limitation on the time, and could they put in another THP for the same land?
Yeah, all it did was say that the approval of the THP was invalid for basically those 5 reasons that I showed. And so that THP was axed and you have to start over from scratch.
Okay. So it looks like we got through almost all the questions. There were really only 2 more topics that I'll just briefly mention if you want to address them. One of which was about the legislative options going forward. The name Damon Connolly was brought up, that he asks every year for legislative proposals, and wondering if, I think this was more of a general question though for the group, has anyone assembled specific legal changes needed? So Ethan, do you know of anything like that? And if not, we'll move to the next final topic.
I haven't heard of him.
Okay. And then the final topic was just, do you have a way for people to find botanists and biologists who have made themselves available for this type of thing?
If you're talking about experts for expert declarations, I think that, you're welcome to, again, reach out to me. The experts that we used were sort of local to the area that you're concerned about. So it depends a little bit on what kind of forests and watershed you're talking about. But yeah, that's kind of a word of mouth type of thing, and networking, just trying to find people who've maybe done it before, who would be willing to do it again.
That's really interesting guidance, though, the fact that it was local people that you reached out to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with that, thank you everybody for asking all the great questions and for staying with us for this presentation. I am going to turn it back to Karen